The Rebbe Zalgazunsen began the Farbrengen this afternoon that this Shabbos comes right after the celebration of the days of Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz. And for this reason we have the Farbrengen this afternoon also as a continuation to the Farbrengen of Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz. In general we know that Shabbos elevates the entire week. In other words, all the days and all the inyanim that have transpired throughout the week get their spiritual elevation on Shabbos. As Chassidus explains, based on the pasuk Vayechulu Hashamayim va'aretz, that everything is uplifted on Shabbos. How much more so is it when it's not an ordinary week, but it's a week with such special inyanim of such great significance, like the inyanim that we had this week, the days of Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz. How much more so is it when right away from Yud Beis, Yud Gimel Tammuz, we enter right away straight into the Shabbos. Yud Beis Tammuz was on Thursday, Yud Gimel Tammuz was on Friday, and right away from this great Chag HaGeula, we go straight into the Yom HaShabbos. So we can imagine that this is a very special Shabbos, and the days of Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz are uplifted on this Shabbos. Shabbos always receives its koyach from the days of the week, as it's explained. How much more so is it when the days of the week are so special, like this week's days, and particularly that the days came out to be so close to Shabbos, Thursday and Friday being Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz, and right afterwards we go into Shabbos. Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz, the Rebbe went on, are the days of the liberation from the Farbrengen Rebbe, when the Farbrengen Rebbe was released from Kostroma. To be more specific, it was on Yud Beis Tammuz that he was told that he's going to be released. However, only few people knew about it on the day of Yud Beis Tammuz. Yud Gimel Tammuz, this was the day when he was really and actually released from Kostroma, and this is the day when he was B'Peil Mamish released from being there. Yud Beis Tammuz back though has another inyan in it, that this is also his date of birth. The Yom HaLedes, the date of birth of the Farbrengen Rebbe, is on Yud Beis Tammuz. And on that specific Yud Beis Tammuz, when he was told that he will be released from prison, from Kostroma, where he was at that time, it was naturally also his Yom HaLedes, and as we know how it's discussed in Sfarim, the great inyan of a Yom HaLedes, and as we know the takana of the Baal Shem Tov, which was revealed to us through the Farbrengen Rebbe, that on the Yom HaLedes of a person, we begin saying the new kapitel of the year which one goes into. So it was again on that Yud Beis Tammuz when he began saying his new kapitel for that year. The Rebbe Zalgazunsen goes on, though many inyanim were discussed in the Farbrengen of Yud Beis Tammuz, though, as we find in Torah, we find the concept of Shana Alav HaKasuv La'akev, which means at times a certain inyan is repeated in the Torah twice to show us the importance of this particular inyan. Or, at times we find when a certain inyan is repeated twice, and there it's an expression of love, particularly by names. Avram, we find in the Torah, name is repeated twice. So Rashi immediately comments, why is the name not mentioned once but twice? It shows the great love that Torah has to this specific person. Same the Rebbe says, though many inyanim were discussed in the Farbrengen of Yud Beis Tammuz, however, due to the importance of this inyan, it is worthwhile to repeat it again in today's Farbrengen. And specifically, the Rebbe said, we today are to take a lesson from the attitude of the Farbrengen Rebbe. The Farbrengen Rebbe at that time was in a very great and powerful country. And we know that Al Pi Torah, there's an inyan of Dina de Malchusa Dina, which means that the rules and regulations which are set up by government, Al Pi Torah, it is our obligation to adhere to these halachas. However, when does this apply? Only when it's not in contradiction to Torah. If government rulings and regulations come out to be contradictory to what we are told in the Torah that we have to do, then naturally we give preference and we follow the instructions from Torah. In the Frierdiker Rebbe's case, we know very well, as the Rebbe himself said in the famous Sikha from him, Frierdiker Rebbe, on Gimel Tammuz, on 3 days in the month of Tammuz, before he went to Kostroma, in other words, being released from the prison and being sent off to the far city of Kostroma. At the train station, the Rebbe at that time stressed that it is only the Yiddish Guf who has gone to Golas. The Neshama of a Yid was never in Golas, and therefore Golas has no effect on the Neshama of a Yid. And therefore nothing will interfere with the obligation that the Neshama has to do unto this world. These were the words from the Frierdiker Rebbe, which he gave words of encouragement before he himself was sent off to the city of Kostroma. And these words he said in public at a train station, where he was well aware that the people who are sending him off to Kostroma are well aware of what he's saying. However, the Frierdiker Rebbe's attitude was that he did not take all these things into any consideration, and he went out full force with spreading Yiddishkeit and seeing to it that Yiddishkeit should not go under in the country where he was at that time, in other words in Russia, where the Frierdiker Rebbe was living, and where the people then tried to do anything and everything within their power to stop the movement and the organization of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So the lesson which we take from the Frierdiker Rebbe's attitude is firstly the firmness, the firm attitude which the Frierdiker Rebbe took, that there was nothing that stopped him. No Indian stood in the way to stop him from going on with his holy work. Though it was literally a sakana for him to do it. He was in danger. And neither did it stop him, neither did it stop any of his followers, any of his shluchim. Everybody kept on even stronger with the work which the Frierdiker Rebbe instructed him to do, which was the spreading of Yiddishkeit and the spreading of Chassidus throughout Russia in that time. And naturally the lesson we take from this is that there is no Inyan Gashmi, in other words, no Gashmiistic thing, no obstacle, no interference which can interfere a Yid at any time from following the instructions of the Rabbeinu Shalom to each and every Yid. Besides, today being Shabbos and being so close to the days of Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz, as just discussed, today's day has another specialty. And that is that right from today is 14 days in the month of Tammuz, right from today we are going into the 15th day into the month of Tammuz. And the 15th day of the month stands for, as the expression is, Kaima Sihara Ba'ashli Musa. That is the day when the moon is in its completion. The day that the moon stands complete, that is on the 15th day of the month. So, in other words, we have the HaKadosh Baruch Hu created Shnei HaMa'oros, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the sun, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the moon. So the days, the system of day and night, this is a system that's from the sun. The system of the monthly system, this is something which comes as a result of the moon. So here we have mitzad both inyanim. Mitzad the inyan of Yemosach, of the inyan of Chama, which is the weekly schedule, the weekly cycle. We are today in the highest day of the cycle, which is the Yom HaShabbos, as well as mitzad the monthly cycle. The Chashivs, the day in the month, is the day when Kaima Siyara Ba'ashli Musa, when the moon is full, complete, and that is the day of Tesvav. 15 days in the month, which we are entering into right from today. In other words, today is 14 days, and tonight and tomorrow will be Tesvav, 15 days in the month of Tammuz. Rabbi quoted a verse from the Maggid. Maggid says in the creation of the world, in Pashas Bereshis, we find when the Rebishter created the world, Rebishter created the oyer light, Vayim Elokim la'oyer, Kadosh Baruch Hu created oyer, and the pasuk, rather than saying Vayhi oyer, the pasuk uses the expression Vayhi chen, it was so. The pasuk does not say Vayhi oyer, that it was the light which HaKadosh Baruch Hu created. As the Rebbe explained, because we know that the light which HaKadosh Baruch Hu created, the initial light which HaKadosh Baruch Hu created, when he originally created the world, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to reduce that light, because it was impossible for the world to get along with such a strong light. Therefore, the pasuk cannot express itself, Vayhi Oyer, that the same Oyer which HaKadosh Baruch Hu created, this Oyer remained, because this is not so. All the pasuk could say is Vayhi Chen. Therefore, the pasuk in Parshas Bereshis, right at the beginning, uses the expression of Vayhi Chen. It was so. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created an inyan of Oyer, and Oyer was in the world. However, not exactly, not in the same format as the Oyer, as the light, as it stood when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the Oyer. Later in the Farbrengen, Rabbi Zalman referred that today is Parshas Balak. And B'negei Parshas Balak, Rabbi said that there's a maimah from the Alter Rebbe, which was recently published. Which was recently published. In other words, it was a manuscript until now, all these years, and it was published recently to such an extent that this week the publication was made complete. And in that Sefer Mamorim from the Alter Rebbe, there is also a maimah from the Alter Rebbe on Parshas Balak. And the Rebbe Zalman explained that Mamorim from the Rabbeim, in general a maimah from the Rebbe, is extremely accurate. Every word in the maimah is very, very accurate, particularly Mamorim from the Alter Rebbe. And we know that the attitude from Hasidim to the maimah of their Rabbeim was, he looked at it with such great amount of respect, that it is like Nisinosa Messinai, like Matan Torah from Sinai. The Rebbe related an episode that there was a very famous chassid, Reb Hillel Paritcher. It was a chassid yet by the Alter Rebbe, Mittel Rebbe, and Tzemach Tzedek. But Alter Rebbe, if I recall correctly, I don't think there's an incident that it's related in the Siches that he saw the Alter Rebbe once, but the Alter Rebbe never really saw him. In other words, he was once in a city where the Alter Rebbe came to visit, and he was hiding behind one of the closets in the room where the Alter Rebbe came in. So he saw the Alter Rebbe, but the Alter Rebbe did not see him. However, later he became very close to Hasidus, and was a chassid, one of the greatest chassidim by the Mittel Rebbe as well as by the Tzemach Tzedek. He was an outstanding goy and an outstanding chassid. Reb Hillel Paritcher once expressed himself as follows. Custom in those days was that after the Rebbe, specific Rebbe, would say a maimah, the selected group of Hasidim would go in again to the Rebbe after the Rebbe saying the maimah and review, have a Chazarah with the Rebbe on the maimah. And it once happened to be where Hasidim, obviously Reb Hillel Paritcher was one of them, got into a discussion with the Rebbe, with the Tzemach Tzedek, I think it was, b'negei pshat in the maimah, in this specific maimah. So later Reb Hillel Paritcher commented as follows. He says, b'shas the Rebbe says the maimah, while the Rebbe says it, at that time it's at a madrega, it's at a level of just like compared it to Matan Torah, Nisinosa Messinai. However, after the Rebbe said the maimah, and it's a question of learning pshat in the maimah, then the Rebbe can have his opinion, and we are permitted to say our opinion as well. We're not bound to go along with the opinion how the Rebbe is learning pshat in the maimah. As an example to this, the Rebbe quoted a Gemara, an interesting Gemara. Gemara relates kamiflige b'mesifta derakia, that there was a machlokes in mesifta derakia, in the yeshiva by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, on various halachic issues, which I think it's a Gemara Bava Basra, which was discussed amongst Tanoim in the Olam HaEmes, and the Tanoim had one opinion, and it was the Rebbeinu Shalom who voiced another opinion. Then when it came, the question aroused Lamaila, what is the halacha? Came out to be that the opinion was, halacha was like the Tanoim that said their opinion, not like the opinion of the Rebbeinu Shalom. And thereby the Rebbeinu Shalom expressed himself, Natzchuni, Bonai, Natzchuna, you have children, you have succeeded over me. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was giving in to the Psak Din of Bnei Yisrael. So again, we've been negated the union of Matan Torah, the Rebbe gave the Torah to Yidden. However, afterwards, after Matan Torah, The Rebishter has given Torah away totally to Yidden, and Yidden, Ta'anoim, have voiced their opinion on a Benegea specific halacha, Benegea specific shaila, and it is Rabbeinu Shalom gave his opinion as well, and when it came to halacha lamaisa came out to be like the Ta'anoim, not like the opinion of the Rabbeinu Shalom. But Benegea and Maimar Chasidus, and Maimar is every single word is extremely accurate, and this is, as Chasidim respected a Maimar to the extent like Nisinosa Misina, like it was given from Sinai. And in this Sefer HaMamorim, which was just printed this week, which has Mamorim from the Alter Rebbe, there the Alter Rebbe discusses the Inyan. It's a Maimar that has a Shaykhus to Pashas Balak, and he discusses the Inyan that we find two contradictory concepts. On one end, we find an Inyan of Lo Yonum V'Lo Yishon, Shema Yisrael, that by the Rebishter does not exist an Inyan of sleep. In other words, the Rebishter always gives Bnei Yisrael fullest attention. We cannot in any way compare it to an attitude of Shina. And on the other hand, we find Psukim which express the thought of Vayikatz Ki Yashan Hashem, that the Rebishter there is a concept of Shina B'Negei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And as the Alter Rebbe gets involved in that Maimar, explaining it, that there depends Bizman She Yisrael or Yisem Retzeinei Shel Makom or Einam Yisem Retzeinei Shel Makom. It depends on what attitude the Yidden are taking to the Rebishter. If Yidden are fulfilling the wish of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, naturally it's Lo Yonum V'Lo Yishon Shema Yisrael. The Rebishter does not sleep. If Chas v'Chalila it's not a matzav of Yisem Retzeinei Shel Makom, then applies the concept of Vayikatz Ki Yashan Hashem. And the Alter Rebbe quotes the pasuk in this week's Sedra of Lehibit Oven B'Yankov V'Leira Amal B'Yisrael Hashem Elekov Imoy Eschuas Melech Boy. Eschuas Melech Boy, Rashi comments, is a lashon chiba v'reyus, a lashon of friendship and warmth which exists between the Rebishter and Yidden. And interestingly, the Rebbe noted that it's appropriate to say over an Inyan that has a shaykhus to these psukim, because these psukim are the part of Chamishi of this week's Sedra. And Chamishi was the shiur in the shiurim of Chitas. Chamishi falls out on the day of Yud Beis Tammuz, which we just celebrated. However, the Alter Rebbe teaches another teaches Schuas Melech Boy, and compares the idea of a Schuas to the Inyan of Trua, to the Inyan of Tkiya Sheifa. Tkiya Sheifa is also an Inyan of Trua. And what's the whole concept of Tkiya Sheifa? Not just a mere Tkiya, a mere performance of a mitzvah, which is a Sheifa which gives out produces various sounds. We know that Rambam explains that the whole concept of Tkiya Shofar is Uru Yishene Mishinaschem. It's a call of awakeness. It's a call to awaken us from our sleep. The Rambam goes further, V'nirdamim hikitzu mitir demaschem. Shina is a lighter way of sleep, and Tardema is a much deeper way of sleep. So the Rambam says that the whole concept of Tkiya Shofar is to awaken us from our sleep. In other words, it's all to bring us to an inyan of tshuva. That's the whole idea of Tkiya Shofar. And the same thing the Alter Rebbe teaches. The pasuk in this week's Sedra is Schuas Melech Boy, that this pasuk also refers to Shofar. And Shofar, which is the idea of tshuva. While talking about Yud Beis Tammuz in the first few sichas, the Rebbe Zalman brought an example, Benegei Matan Torah. Matan Torah, we find, on one hand, Matan Torah was a one-time occasion. To such an extent that it's quoted in Svarim that even when Mashiach will come, again a Matan Torah it will not be. Matan Torah was once. Though the Chazal tell us that the Torah which is learned today is hevel, is compared to air, in comparison to the Torah which is going to be learned when Mashiach will come. In other words, when Mashiach will come, the Torah which we are going to be learning is going to be a much deeper one as the Torah we are learning now. However, on the other hand, Matan Torah will be only once. At the same time, we find there's an inyan of Shavuos, Yontif Shavuos. Year after year, we celebrate the Yontif Shavuos. What is the celebration of the Yontif Shavuos? Here we have what's behind celebrating this Yontif? We celebrate the Yontif when the Rebbe gave us the Torah. Together with this, we also have every single day we recite Baruch Atah Hashem Neis Na Torah. We say Birchas HaTorah daily, and daily we recite that the Rebbe is the Neis Na Torah. And as Chazal tell us, and Rashi quotes in Chumash, why is this? Because b'chol yom v'yom yiyu beinecha kechadashim. We have to look at Torah that every day, as if with such a warmth, with such an inspiration, as if we've received it on this given day. Every day again. Same the Rebbe compared, though Yud Beis Tammuz was a one-time occasion, it was something which took place 50-something years ago when the Frierdiker Rebbe was released out of prison. However, when it comes Yud Beis Tammuz, each and every year we celebrate again Yud Beis Tammuz. However, the Hayrois, the lessons which we can derive from Yud Beis Tammuz, this is something which we have to, the message from Yud Beis Tammuz, this is something which we have to carry with us throughout the entire year. Throughout the year, we can derive koiches and inspiration from the attitude of the Frierdiker Rebbe and the stand which the Frierdiker Rebbe took and all the details of the arrest of the Frierdiker Rebbe, all the inyanim revolving Yud Beis Tammuz. Later in the Farbrengen, when it came to learn, as usual, a Rashi in this week's Chazarah, and the Rebbe also explains a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, as well as an inyan in the commentary of his father on the Zohar HaKodesh. The Rebbe said, being that this Farbrengen is a Yud Beis Tammuz like Farbrengen, it would be very appropriate that all of these inyanim which we are going to discuss should all have a shaychus to Geulah. B'negeya the Mishnah in Avos, this afternoon we recited the 6th Perek. Everybody is accustomed to recite Pirkei Avos in the weeks of between Pesach and Shavuos. However, for the entire summer, the Alter Rebbe writes, Yesh noyagin kach, there are some that feel sich to do so for the entire summer as well. The Rebbe says if we look back by the previous Rabbeim, and we look at the Mamorim which they said during summer Shabbosim, we know that the beginning of a Maimah is usually with a pasuk of that Sedra. We will find many beginnings of Mamorim from the Rabbeim with a Mishnah and Pirkei Avos. And this will apply to Shabbosim after Shavuos as well. In other words, Shabbosim throughout the entire summer. So there we see that the Rabbeim were accustomed saying Pirkei Avos not only between Pesach and Shavuos, but as well throughout the entire summer. Perek Shishi discusses the greatness of Torah. And the Mishnah, or the Beraisa, which it really is, tells us that there are 48 ways to acquire Torah. Torah niknis barboim u'shmoina dvorim. The very last of the 48 is ha'omer davar b'shem oimroi. If one says an inyan in Torah, he should say it in behalf of whom he heard this inyan, in the name whom he heard it from. This is the conclusion of the 48 inyanim which Torah can be acquired. Hala madata, the Mishnah concludes. From here we have a lesson. If anybody says something in behalf of whom he heard it from, this brings Geula to the world. Shenema, Mishnah quotes a pasuk. When Esther told King Achashverosh the message that Bigsan Viseresh were planning to kill Achashverosh, she told it to the Melech in the name of Mordechai, in behalf of Mordechai. Very strange Mishnah. Pirkei Avos is Mila de Chasidusa. In Yonim of Lefnim Mishuras Hadin. In other words, in Yonim which Al Pi Halacha we are not obligated to do that. It's beyond our halachic obligations. An inyan which we are required to do Al Pi Chasidus. Mishnah tells us there are 48 ways how one can acquire Torah. The last and final one of it is that when we hear something in somebody else's name, we should always repeat it in this person's name. Child learns Mishnah. Ben Esa le-Mishnah. Just like Ben Chomish le-Mikra, it's a Ben Esa le-Mishnah. Child knows that he came home numerous times and told things to his parents and to his father, name of his Rebbe, whatever he heard in Cheder from his Rebbe, and he still sees that it did not bring Geula l'Olam, it did not bring Geula to the world, we are still in Golus. Furthermore, Rebbe says it's a Mogen Avram in Eure Chaim, where a Mogen Avram paskens l'halacha, that if we heard an inyan and learning from somebody, and we do not repeat it in his name, the Mogen Avram says it's Gezeilah. Not only is it's not a milah de chasidus, it's an inyan of chasidus, al pi pirkei avos. It's outright gzeila. If we hear something in somebody else's name and we do not repeat it in his behalf, the Magen Avraham paschals la'alach, it's gzeila. Something else. Mishnah discusses 48 inyanim of acquiring Torah. And the Mishnah just goes one after another. It comes to ha'im adava b'shem ha'imrei, which this is the last one. The Mishnah should have stopped here. Fine. So this is also a very chashiv inyan. No. Mishnah goes ahead. Hala madata. From here we derive. If somebody says something over in the name of somebody else, maybe gula loyla. Brings gula to the world. So we see the Mishnah gives this inyan a special amount of chashivas amongst all other 48 inyanim. Why is this? What is so outstanding in this inyan that comes as a conclusion to the 48, and we know that when something that we conclude with is a very important significance, it's always that way, this klal. What is so outstanding in milah de chasidus, a way to acquire Torah, this inyan that a aimer davar should be b'shemayim? And here the Rebbe explained this whole inyan of repeating something in behalf of somebody else. And the Rebbe brought an interesting example. That there was a Tana Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said, Kol yomai, all my days, all the inyanim I said in learning, is all inyanim that I have heard my Rabbi say. I didn't say anything of my own. This is how Rabbi Eliezer once praised himself. Said about himself. At the same time, we find quotations from Rabbi Eliezer many, many times in Shas. And it does not say each time from whom did he hear this specific halacha. Here is the Tana that is known and noted for not saying anything of his own, and at the very same time, each time in Yonim are quoted in his behalf, there is never anything mentioned from whom he heard it. Furthermore, we find in Tanya, the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe immediately writes on the front page of the Tanya, that in Yonim, which are explained in Tanya, are melukat mipi svarim v'soifrim, are taken from sources of svarim v'soifrim. And throughout the Sefer HaTanya, the Alter Rebbe does not quote the Magid or the Baal Shem Tov more than very few times. So Mamanishach, if this inyan of saying something on somebody's behalf is of such great importance, why don't we find it constantly in Chazal and in later Svarim that this inyan should be adhered to? So as the Rebbe Zalman explained, for example, Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, true, everything he learned from his Rabbeim. He never said anything which he did not hear from his Rebbe. However, when Rabbi Eliezer repeated this specific inyan, Rabbi Eliezer had taken over this inyan so well in his own mind that it became part and parcel of Rabbi Eliezer already, that he did not have to mention anybody else's name. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer, as I feel gahar of it, put his mind so much into these inyanim and Torah that had it been up to himself, he also would have achieved and reached to this understanding of this specific halacha or another specific halacha. These inyanim and Torah, as the expression goes in Chassidus, were nisatzim with him. It became part of him already. And therefore Rabbi Eliezer did not repeat it in any specific name. The Mishnah here, when the Mishnah is telling us 48 ways to acquire Torah, and the Mishnah is concluding with ha'aymer dava b'shem aymrai, the Mishnah means something completely different, the Rebbe says. Ha'aymer dava b'shem aymrai, achas diber elikim shtayim zu shamati. Who was the aymer of Torah? Who is the one that originally said Torah? The Rabbeinu Shalom. And it is our obligation to know that when one thinks he has gone through all 48 levels of all 47 levels of acquiring Torah, he's really got himself fully engrossed in Torah. He's in Torah. Him and Torah cannot be departed. He's one with Torah. So the Mishnah is telling us, true, but a Yid must always remember, ha'omer dava, when you're saying Torah, you should remember whose Torah you're learning. Oimrai. Who is the originator of Torah? Torah is the Rabbeinu Shalom. Here the Rebbe brought the Gemara. Gemara tells us, Gemara Nedarim, Alma of the Haaretz, why was Eretz Yisrael destroyed? Why were the Yidden driven out of Eretz Yisrael? Gemara responds, Al Shalei Baruchu B'Torah Tchila, that Yidden learned Torah, however they did not make Birchas HaTorah. The Rebbe asked, is this a strong enough reason for Yidden to be driven out of Eretz Yisrael? They learned Torah, they fulfilled mitzvahs, however they did not say Birchas HaTorah, so what? No. What's the pshat they did not say Birchas HaTorah? What do we say in Birchas HaTorah? Baruch Ata Hashem Noisen HaTorah. Pshat is Yidden learned Torah and forgot on the originator of Torah. Who is the Noisen HaTorah, the Rabbeinu Shalom? Loi Baruchu B'Torah Tchila. And when Yidden learn Torah and forget on the Noisen HaTorah Chas V'Shalom, this is good enough reason for Avda Haaretz. Therefore, Mishnah here tells us, we shall know that once, and that's why this thing comes at the very last of all the 48 ways to acquire Torah. In other words, a person who succeeded in learning Torah and has gone through all different 47 ways which Mishnah tells us, which are advices and helpful for one to acquire Torah and be successful with Torah. However, a Yid has to know how great he is in Torah. He has to be Omer Davar. But there's the Omer of Torah who is the Rabbeinu Shalom. Hala Marita, Kala Omer Davar B'Shem Omeroi. What is the quotation? Quotation from a pasuk, V'Tomer Esther LaMelech B'Shem Mordechai. We know Chassidus explains that each time it is mentioned Melech in Megillas Esther, it really refers to the Rabbeinu Shalom. Achashverosh always means the Eibishter, because the Eibishter is Achis V'Reish Shaloi. Melech is the Rabbeinu Shalom. Esther, the Gemara tells us, Esther min ha-Torah minayin. What source do we have for Esther? What remez do we have for Esther in Chumash? Gemara brings the pasuk, Haster Aster Ponai. In Indian of Helen is the Indian of Esther. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu not revealing himself. The opposite of him revealing himself is the word of Esther. What does Mordechai represent? Mordechai represents Klal Yisrael. Stands for Knesset Yisrael. That's the idea of Mordechai. Olam, Bichlal, the world. We know Chassidus always stresses, Olam stems from the word Helen. The world is also a cover-up on godliness. Godliness is not seen in this world. What did Esther? V'Tomer Esther LaMelech B'Shem Mordechai. Esther, which is also from the word Hester, cover-up, came to the Melech, to the Rabbeinu Shalom, B'Shem Mordechai in behalf of Knesset Yisrael, and related to the Eibishter. How the whole avodah of Knesset Yisrael on this world is to take away this helem, this cover-up on godliness which is existing in this world, and bring to the revelation of Rabbeinu Shalom. This is the whole idea of V'Tomer Esther LaMelech B'Shem Mordechai, and this is the whole idea of Torah. In other words, the whole union of Torah. And when Yid is learning Torah, and he's an Omer Davar B'Shem Omeroi, he's associating himself with the Omer of Torah. Ultimately, what does this bring to? This brings to Geula Le'olam. And when we're talking about Geula, does not mean a physical Geula, the Geula which will come through the coming of Mashiach. Here we're talking about a completely different union. While the Rebbe was asking the questions in the Mishnah, the Rebbe also brought the Gemara. The Gemara tells us on the pasuk, the famous pasuk, Pada b'shalom nafshi mikravli. So the Gemara says, Kala oisek b'toira b'gemilas chasadim or mispalem atzibur. Anybody that learns Torah and is involved in gemilas chesed and davos im atzibur. In other words, these are all three categories of Torah, avodah, gemilas chasadim. The Rebbe says, Mala ani alav ki'ilu pada'ani li ulabanai mebeina umas. It is considered as if you've taken me and my children, the Rebbe says, out of Golus. Also in Tanya it's explained that there's a concept of a geula pratis. Though we are still in Golus, however, an individual soul may be successful in uplifting himself, getting himself out of Golus, and having a geula pratis, in other words, a spiritual uplifting for this person. So while the Rebbe was learning the Shilas in this Mishnah, so the question was still that when one is a Omer Davar B'Shem Omeroi, we don't see it bringing to any physical Geula. And the child who is learning Mishnah, the Ben Esel and Mishnah, is not yet familiar with what's explained in Tanya, that there's a concept of a Geula Pratis, or what the Gemara in Bracha says, that when one is a Oisik B'Torah B'Gemilas Chasadim and Mispalem Atzibur, there's an inyan of this leading to a Keilu Pida'ani Liu Labanem Ebein Umas, as if he had redeemed the Rebbeinu and his children out of Golus. So therefore the question was, to what type of Geula does this lead? Now the Rebbe is teaching us that the Pshat in the Mishnah is it leads to a spiritual inyan, it adds Kedusha in this world. That's what the Mishnah is talking about. That Toimer Esther Lamelech B'Shem Mordechai. That Esther, which stems from the word Helam v'Hester, a cover-up on godliness. However, when a Yid is tied in with the Neisen HaTorah, when a Yid learns Torah and ties himself in with the Rabbeinu Shalom, who is the Oimroi, the Oimer of Torah, this brings to it that there should be an extra, that the Helam v'Hester, the cover-up which is ungodliness, which is in this world, should be removed. And should reveal more and more Kedusha in this world. After learning this Mishnah, the Rebbe says, we're talking in Yud Beis Tammuz, and es will sich nicht, it's not too much desirable that we should remain explaining here about an Inyan Shel Geula, and it should not be the final Geula. We're talking about Geula, but it's really not the real and ultimate Geula of getting out of Golus. And this is something which we are really constantly hoping for. Because even the Geula, which Vatayma Esther LaMelech B'Shem Mordechai led to, also it wasn't right away, it took a couple of years. But even this Geula was also a Geula in a format, as the Gemara uses the expression, Akate Avde Dachashverosh Hanun. The Yidden Take were rescued from Haman and his decree, but they still remained under the regime of Achashverosh. And when we are talking, we recite daily in davening, Semach David Avdecham Heras Atzmiach. We are constantly hoping for the Geula. Even in Shabbos and Yontif, when we do not say Semach David and Shemon Esrei, we still say V'sechzena Ineinu B'Shufcha L'Tzion. We still are begging the Rabbeinu Shalom to get us back to Tzion. So the Rebbe says it's not desirable to remain here in a Mishnah and in a Pshat, which is only talking about a step in Geula, but not the final and ultimate Geula. Therefore the Rebbe says, let us go further in this Perek. What does this Perek conclude with? The words of Hashem Yimloch Loilam Vod. The last words of Perek Shishi are Hashem Yimloch Loilam Vod, that the Rebbe will rule forever. And when will the ruling of HaKadosh Baruch Hu be obvious and seen by all that it is Hashem Yimloch Loilam Vod? This is through the coming of Mashiach. And that is why, what do we conclude Pirkei Avos with? With the saying of Ratzak Hananya ben Akasha, Ratzak HaKadosh Baruch Hu lezakas es Yisrael. The Rebbe wanted to be mezaki Yidden. That is why Hirba lehem Torah and mitzvahs. So the Rebbe tied this into what the Gemara says. Zachu achishena. Gemara asks, there's a contradiction between two psukim. One place the Gemara, there's a pasuk that says that the Geula will come at the set time. There's another pasuk that says that the Geula will be hastened by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, will be rushed. So the Gemara responds, Be'ita achishena. So the Gemara responds, Loi zachu, if the Yidden wouldn't be zeiche, then it is Be'ita, it will be in its set time. If the Rebbe will help zachu, they will be zeiche, then achishena, the Rebbe will rush the Geula. So here at the last words of this Perek are Hashem Yimlech Leilam Vod. And right afterwards we talk about Ratzah HaKadosh Baruch Hu lezakos es Yisrael. Zakos, same idea as Zachu. The Yidden should be merited in being Zeiche through their Maisim for the Inyan of Geula. Then we will be Zeiche to a final Geula, the coming of Mashiach, which will be the final Geula, a Geula she'ein achareha Golus, a Geula which does not have any Golus afterwards whatsoever. The Zohar in this week's Sedra, tells a story that there were a group of Amoraim that were walking, and the mother was walking with her child. Mother, seeing a group of Amoraim, takes this Yenuka, this child, and suggests the child to go over to the Amoraim and ask the Amoraim for a bracha for the child. The child said, no, I don't want to. Why? I sense on the odor of their levushim, of their clothing, that these Tanoim did not lay chishma in time on this morning. And therefore the child resented to ask for a bracha from this group of Tanoi. Tanoim, hearing what the child said, responded, it is true. However, we were involved with another mitzvah. We were involved in the mitzvah of Hachnosas Kala, of Chassan Kala. And therefore we had no time to learn Krishma Bizman. It's an episode which took place, which the Zohar tells us about, which obviously requires explanation. As the Rebbe Zilgezinson explained it today, what is the inyan of Chassan Kala? We all know that the Rebishter and Yidden are compared to Chassan Kala. It is brought in Svarim that the time now is compared to a time of Eirusin. It is only first level of marriage, which Bizman HaGemara was compared to Eirusin. However, when will be a full and ultimate marriage between the Rebishter and the Yidden, a level of Nesuyin, this will be when Mashiach will come. In other words, there are two types of mitzvahs. There are mitzvahs which are mitzvahs maisiyas, mitzvahs where we do action. There are other mitzvahs which are only in dibur, which only are saying, for example, the reading of Krishma, and bring to certain makifdika accomplishments. However, they do not penetrate in the pnimis. The Pshat, what the Amoraim said, that they were involved in the inyan of Achnosas Kala, inyan of being Mesameach Chassan V'Kala, means they were doing inyanim which should lead to the ultimate inyan of Chassan V'Kala, to the marriage of the Rabbeinu Shalom, to the final marriage, to the inyan of Nesuyin, which is the inyan of Geula. When will Nesuyin take place between the Rebishter and Yidden? This will be by Geula. So therefore they responded that what they were involved in is an inyan which is an inyan of Maisa, an inyan of action, and an inyan of Maisa which will have an impact and ultimately leading to the final step of Nesuyin. That is why they overlooked reading Krishma Bizmano, which in comparison to this inyan is an inyan which is only makiftik. In other words, they felt that they will accomplish more by being involved in doing practical inyanim, which would lead to the getting Yidden out of Golas, which means the inyan of Chassan V'Kala, which will lead to the Nesuyin between the Rebishter and Yidden, the marriage between the Rebishter and Knesset Yisrael, rather than only protecting themselves and learning Krishma Bizman. And the Rebbe here brought that there's a Gemara, the Gemara says, Benegei nails of a person, after the nails are cut, there's a shayla what has to be done with it. So the Gemara uses the expression Chosid Seirfon, that a Chosid takes his nails after they were cut off and burns them. So in Svarim it's explained that when a part of a person's body is burnt, it could lead to harm. Spiritually, it can have a harm on the person. However, Chosid does not take this in consideration, being that the Gemara says that it's an initial sakone for nails to be around. So the Gemara explains it. Therefore, the Chassid looks away on himself and puts himself into an inyan shal sakane, rather than somebody else should be hurt through his nails, through his siparnai. So the very same was the attitude of those Amayroim. They looked aside on their own learning Krishma Bizmanai, as long as they should be able to accomplish something fundamental that should lead to the inyan of the real Simchas Chassan V'Kala, which is the inyan HaGeula. While talking about this inyan of Chassid, Rabbi said there are some that feel that when we talk about inyanim b'negei chassidus, they really do not live up to the proper standard of a chassid, and they feel that whatever they do, as far as feeling sich like a chassid, is really not done truly. It's like, we copy or we do it without really living up to it. But wholeheartedly, we are not yet at the level of doing these specific minhagei chassidus. So the Rebbe related that somebody once came to the Alter Rebbe and told the Alter Rebbe that there are a group of Chassidim in that specific city, that these Chassidim are not fearing sich, they are not true Chassidim. In other words, they are acting in accordance with minhagim of Chassidus, but really in depth, they are really not Chassidim. Well, the Rebbe thought for a moment, and then he responded, really? It will be fulfilled in them what the Mishnah says. He didn't say anything yet. this individual felt satisfied. Because the Alter Rebbe says, they'll get it. That whatever the Mishnah says will be fulfilled. So while he was like still thinking, the Alter Rebbe tells him, I'll tell you what Mishnah I'm referring to. The Mishnah says that if somebody makes himself, a person should be thankful to the Rebbeishter that the Rebbeishter has created him, that his hands are well and his feet are well and he can walk straight and move around. However, when a person makes himself limping and he really does not have to, the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, ultimately he will be punished that way. That's what the Mishnah says. The same the Mishnah says if a person goes around begging for tzedakah and really is not in need of tzedakah, he has his own earnings. So the Mishnah says, ultimately he will have to come on to tzedakah. The same the Alter Rebbe said will be with these people. If they make themselves, if they are acting like Chassidim, but in the meantime they are really not Chassidim, you know what their end will be? Their end will be that they'll really be true Chassidim. So this is what the Rebbe added on today when he was talking and discussing the Inyan, what a real Chassid is. B'negeya the Rashi in this week's Sedre, so it's also appropriate to discuss an Inyan that has a Shaychus to Giyula, and also an Inyan which is in the Shiur Tchitas of Yud Beis Tammuz. And the Rebbe found an Inyan which is in the Shiur of Yud Beis Tammuz as well as in the Shiur of Yud Gimel Tammuz. An Inyan in Rashi in this week's Sedra which requires an interpretation, which requires explanation. And it's a similar pasuk which we find in Chamishi and we find in Shishi. If we look into Chamishi, after Chamishi, pasuk tells us, Hein kilovi yakum uchari isnasa. Bilam here is talking about Klal Yisrael and saying that Klal Yisrael, it is pasuk Chav Dalet, Kapitel Chav Gimel, pasuk Chav Dalet. Klal Yisrael will be very powerful. There will be Kilavi Yakum will rise. A Lavi is a junior lion. Ukari is a female lion. Ukari is Nasa, and like a lion. Lo Yishkav ad Yochal Teref does not go to sleep. Ad Yochal Teref v'dam chalolim yishte. If we look into Rashi, Rashi gives us a whole lengthy explanation that when Yidden rise from their sleep in the morning, they rise like a lion. And they run like a lion to grab mitzvahs. Lachtefes are mitzvahs. What mitzvahs do they grab? Tzitzis, krishme, and the putting on of tefillin. Lo yishkav balayla al mitosai. Yidden do not go to sleep until they harm all the mazikim, all those that want to harm Yidden. Who are those? How do Yidden harm all their mazikim? By learning krishme. Keitzad? How does he do it? Koyre shmal mitosai umafkid ruchot biyad amokim, and gives away his neshama in the hands of the Rebishter, and the Rebishter takes care of solves all our problems. Davaracha, this is all one pshat in Rashi. What is the second pshat in Rashi? That hein am kelovi yakum is like the Targum. Kitargumai. What the Targum teaches. What does the Targum teach? That the Yidden will be very successful when they will have to take over the various nations which they will have to take over while conquering Eretz Yisrael. In Shishi, we also find the pasuk Kora Shochav Ka'ari Ukalovi Mi Kimenu, that Yidden are compared to an Ari. Here Rashi does not get involved into this whole explanation, but Rashi refers us Kitargumai, like the Targum says. Yisyashvu ba'artzom b'koyach u'b'gvura. They will be able to conquer their countries with strength and very powerful. Naturally, this is the derech of Rashi, that when an Inyan appears twice, where does Rashi explain it? The first time. Rashi is not going to leave us once and not explain anything, and later come to the second time and there explain. The emphasis, what Rashi says here, is a Gemara, and is a Medrash. It's a Medrash Tanchumah, and is a Gemara. Interestingly, that the Gemara says it on the second pasuk. The Medrash says it on the first pasuk. Why the Gemara says it on the second pasuk is not our inyan, because in Pshuta Shel Mikra, naturally it also requires an explanation, but the Rebbe does not get into it. But in Pshuta Shel Mikra, naturally it's more obvious that when we come across an inyan the first time, it requires interpretation. Something very strange. Rashi tells us that his inyan is always to follow the realm of Pshat. If Rashi, for any reason, does not learn Al Pi Pshat, but Rashi gets involved in explaining the pasuk Al Pi Drash, Rashi always gives us an introduction. Rabbi Seinu Doshu, in Medrash it's explained, or we even find an expression in Rashi, Ha pasuk hazeh oy medarsheni, that this pasuk we cannot learn Al Pi Pshat, we are forced to learn this specific pasuk Al Pi Drash. Here Rashi does not give any introduction whatsoever. And immediately Rashi gets involved in explaining the pasuk of Hein Am Kelavi Yakum. How does Rashi explain it? It's a drash, it's not Pshuta Shel Mikra. How Yidden grab mitzvahs. This is not the Pashat Pshat in the attention of Bilam. And Rashi says this as the first Pshat. What is the second Pshat in Rashi? Davaracha Kitargum. And we know when Rashi says a Pshat 1 and Pshat 2, the second Pshat comes only because there's a certain shverikite or something hard, something wrong in the first Pshat, which is, however, the primary Pshat. But being that there's some question in that Pshat, that is why we have to come on to a second Pshat. Here, obviously, it's completely the contrary. Rashi takes an inyan of a medrash, does not even mention it's a medrash, does not even say it's a drash or anything, and this is what Rashi puts as the very first Pshat. Davaracha, there's also another way of learning the pasuk like the Targum is. Also, Rashi lists several mitzvahs. Lilvosh tzitzes, likro yeshma, ulahaniach tefillin. If we look through the way in the Torah, the way these inyanim are discussed, tzitzes is not mentioned first. Tzitzes is mentioned where in Pasha Shlach. Tefillin is discussed much earlier. Tefillin is discussed in Chumash Shmos and Pashas Boy. We already read about tefillin. So why doesn't Rashi go according to the way these inyanim are discussed, the Seder, the way these inyanim are discussed in the Torah? But Rashi jumps and mentions tzitzes first, later Shema, and later tefillin. Actually, what happened here was Balak invited Bilam on behalf of all the other kings. And what did he call him for? He didn't call him to bench the Yidden. On the contrary. He had a problem. The Yidden were almost about to enter his territory. And he called on Bilam, that Bilam should come and advise him, how can Klal Yisrael be weakened, and how can he overcome Klal Yisrael, that Klal Yisrael should not take over his territory. That is really what Bilam came for. The emes is that how did the Yidden conquer Sichon v'Oig, for example? Here the Yidden were involved in taking over the territories of Sichon v'Oig, or Moav, Ammon. So b'negei Oig Melech HaBashan we know that Oig Melech HaBashan was very tall. The Chazal tell us that Moshe Rabbeinu was also tall, however not as tall, far from it. Moshe Rabbeinu was Eser Amos. He jumped Eser Amos. And he had a sword in his hand which was Eser Amos, and that is how he harmed Oig Melech HaBashan, he killed him, and that is how the Yidden were able to take over the country of Oig Melech HaBashan. There was no need of having war in the form of a lion, of a Lavi or an Ari. Same thing even later when the Yidden crossed the Yarden and came to take over Eretz Yisrael. So we know that the Yidden surrounded the wall of Yericho, and Yericho served as Man'ula Shel Eretz Yisrael. It was the key to Eretz Yisrael. And when the Rebbe helped that the wall of Yericho fell, that is when the Yidden took over all of Eretz Yisrael. So again, there was no need for them to exercise a format of Lavi or Nari. Therefore, Rashi does not want to learn that the pasuk of Hein Am Kelavi Yakum Ukariyas Nasa is referring to the Targum, like the Targum says, that it means that the Yidden are powerful as a lion when they will be involved in the battles to take over Eretz Yisrael. There was no need for that. In Pshuta Shel Mikra, we just read last week the Rashi, which the Rebbe discussed in last week's Farbrengen, how powerful Sichon was, and how powerful his nation was. What did the Rebbeinu do? The Rebbeinu performed the nest. The Rebbeinu took Sichain and his people, took them all on the outside of the city, and the Yidden were able and knocked them out right then and there, and the Yidden were able to walk into the cities, and all that was left in the cities was Noshem Muktana. So again, they did not have to exercise the Ari or the Lavi. Furthermore, if we look into the pasuk, Heinam Kilavi Yakum Ukariyis Nasa, the pasuk is talking in a Lashon Osid. The time will come that this nation will act like a Lavi and act like an Ari. They will express their attitude and their behavior will be similar to an Ari, similar to a lion. So when Rashi sees this pasuk, Rashi in Pshuta Shel Mikra cannot say that Bilam here was referring to something which was Negeya right then and there, because first of all he's talking in an expression of Lashon Asid. Secondly, for right then and there was no need to exercise it in the format of an Alavi or an Ari. So because of these two reasons, Rashi says that what Bilam really told Balak, true, you called me not to praise the Yidden, but as Balak himself said, I called you, Vayema Balak el Bilam, as the Pasha concludes, Gam koiv loisif kenu, gam barach loisif achenu. He complained, he was unsatisfied. Bilam did not do what Balak invited him for. He didn't accomplish what he hired him for, what he retained him for. So that's why Rashi in Pshuta Shel Mikra right away learns Pshat, that what did Bilam refer to? Bilam referred that on the future, that the Yidden in the future will be so powerful and so strong spiritually that they will grab mitzvahs. Memela, this is a nation you cannot overcome, you cannot succeed them. Why? Because they have a specialty with them. What is their specialty? What is their koyach? Hein am, this is a nation, kilovi yakum okari yisnasa. They are extremely powerful. What does their power express itself in? That they will grab and run after mitzvahs. Why Rashi mentions mitzvahs in such a sequence? The Rebbe learns because this is the way the child sees it. First the child sees the inyan of putting on tzitzis, then he sees the inyan of Shema, and then there's an inyan of Hanachas Tefillin. Hanachas Tefillin comes to the child last. The Rebbe also mentioned that there's a shakla v'taya, there's a question if the Yidden put on Tefillin in the midbar. Melem, could be there are some that claim that the Yidden did not begin putting on tefillin until they entered Eretz Yisrael, or at least with a bracha until they entered Eretz Yisrael. This is something which is discussed in Svarim. Therefore, Rashi is learning Pshat in the pasuk that the pasuk is talking about something future which will happen. However, being that it's in Pshuta Shel Mikra, we still have to find that Bilam was not talking about something which will happen in many, many years. Obviously, Bilam came to discuss the situation as it was at that time. So that is why Rashi brings Davaracha. There is another pshat that Ataka pertains b'negei the Milchamis which the Yidden were involved. However, in Pshuta Shel Mikra it's hard to learn this way, because in Pshuta Shel Mikra they did not have to exercise any attitude of an Ari or Lavi in order that they should succeed in their Milchamis which they had to conquer Eretz Yisrael. I mentioned that there's the Eira Chaim HaKodesh, who's a commentary on Chumash, and interesting that tonight, in other words tomorrow, Tes Vav Tammuz, is the Yortzeit of the Eira Chaim HaKodesh. And the Eira Chaim HaKodesh is very much respected in Chassidus, and the Shem HaGdolim, the Chidah writes, Shem HaGdolim writes that he heard that in Polania, in Poland, the Baal Shem Tov arranged and suggested to his Chassidim that they should learn Chumash with the commentary, with the Pirush of the Eira Chaim HaKodesh. And Rebbe said that he also heard, he did not hear it from the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe always, when he refers to various historic things, historic information, his main source is always the Frierdiker Rebbe. He says this Inyan he did not hear from the Frierdiker Rebbe, but he did hear it from Chassidim. That Chassidim said, would the Baal Shem Tov and the Eira Chaim, they lived in the same time. The Baal Shem Tov lived in Poland while the Eira Chaim lived in Eretz Yisrael. If the Baal Shem Tov and the Eira Chaim HaKodesh would have gotten together, this would have brought the Geula, this would have brought the coming of Mashiach. However, the Eira Chaim HaKodesh does explain this pasuk, Hein am kilavi yokum ukarius nasa in his commentary on Chumash, he taka explains that it does have the shayches, but again to the milchamis which the Yidden were involved in to conquering Eretz Yisrael. However, in Pshuta Shel Mikra, as we just discussed, we cannot learn that way. It only can come as a secondary pshat. However, when we come to the pasuk which is in the parsha of Yud Gimel Tammuz, in other words, the pasuk of which is in Shishi, there the pasuk uses the expression Kora Shachav Ka'ariyu Kolavi Mi Yikimenu. There the pasuk does not talk specifically in a lashon asid. It's a lashon which can be interpreted anyway. It can be interpreted a lashon haive and could be interpreted as a lashon asid. So that is why there Rashi brings the pshat only kitargumai. But again, the Rebbe says, Rashi bringing kitargumai over there does not mean that the whole arichas which Rashi told us a parsha ago does not apply over there. Rashi does not have to repeat the same minyan in Chamishi and repeat the same minyan in Shishi. The child who's learning Shishi still refers to whatever was discussed in Chamishi. So that is why Rashi does not repeat it. However, why does Rashi mention the Targumai? Why does he mention the Targum Pshat, which does apply Yisyashvu ba'artzam b'koyachug b'gvura? Because over there it's glatika in Shishi. It's glatika, it's smoother. Here to learn Pshat that it applies to the way the Yidden will conquer Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because here the pasuk is not talking in a lashon ada. The pasuk here is also talking, in a lashon asid. In a future expression, the pasuk here is talking in an expression which can be interpreted in many ways. So therefore, here we can learn Kora Shachav Ka'ariyu Kalavi, and it could come also as a first pshat, Kitargumai, which the Targum teaches, Yisyashvu ba'altzam b'koyach b'gevurah.